The following contains situations and circumstances that are relatable to all women, but are still uncomfortable and sometimes quite awful. We don't pull any punches. Listener discretion is advised.
Life's a foolish game. Do you ever feel the same? Well, maybe we could change, turn the ship another way. Feel it in the darkness, we're sailing right into those jagged cliffs. Yeah. Some say we've always been insane. Hey, life's a foolish game. Life's a foolish game.
Elizabeth and Mary, the Virgin Queen and the Queen of Scots. Although cousins, they couldn't have been more different. Beautiful, adored, and advantaged, Mary grew up believing she had a glorious destiny awaiting, while neglected, rejected, and exploited Elizabeth had to constantly outmaneuver just to survive. Sometimes, no matter where you come from, no one gets to live happily ever after. Welcome to Frenemies, a Toil and Trouble Media original. On this show, we discuss notable women and the rivalries that helped define them. Today, we return to the 16th century British Isles, where Elizabeth was crowned and Mary was relocating. In August 1561, Mary returned to her Scottish kingdom. It was a real culture shock. Scotland was foreign and almost primitive when compared to the lush pageantries of Versailles. Things had changed greatly in the time she had been away, too, and she had no way to prepare for just how much. While she was away, her homeland converted to Protestantism. Many of her subjects saw the Pope as a heretic. If that wasn't enough, the culture and ideas flourishing in other parts of Europe were ignored in favor of feuds and violence. Even the parties these people threw were barbaric. It's like they didn't know how to throw a ball without splaying dead animals about. And don't get her started on haggis. What's worse, she wasn't even seen as a celebrity. Hardly anyone knew her, far less could recognize her on the street. And in spite of her impeccable grace and mannerisms, her countrymen viewed her as almost alien. No one complimented her style. There was no real court to speak of. In her so-called homeland, the privileged class were clannish brutes, more committed to beefs and beatdowns than supporting the crown. The nobles one could always rely on in France to come through in a bind were virtually non-existent in Hooterville. From the looks of the hicks and skirts with their gap-filled smiles, she was beginning to think she was over her head. But with the backing of her half-brother, the Earl of Moray, Mary found her feet. Deferring to Moray and the council, she governed minimally. She made compromises, including adopting a stance of religious tolerance. Of course, that was probably more advantageous to her than anyone else, as it allowed her to attend Mass without being imprisoned. But it allowed her to maintain the crown and her head. So there was that. And she was open to the idea of another marriage. In 16th century Europe, royal marriage was an expectation, if not a demand. Having women running around with power was against the natural order of things, not to mention tradition. Of course, these kind of sentiments were perpetuated by the politically advantaged men in the background, so remember what I said in that last episode about throat punching. In the early days of her reign, Elizabeth was pressured to do the same. She even entertained a public relationship of her own with Lord Robert Dudley. The two were seen throughout Europe, dancing, hunting, and attending parties. I wonder what the media of today would have called their coupling. Elizabeth? Robabeth? Either way, while their frequent appearances gave commoners a thrill, her advisors were aghast by their questionable relationship. Not only did it throw her virginity back into question, but Dudley, the son of an executed traitor, was already married. Nice. The scrutiny only further intensified when Lady Dudley died at the couple's home under mysterious circumstances. Her body found at the bottom of a staircase. Soon, rumors began circulating that Dudley had murdered his wife and that Elizabeth was planning to marry him. But instead, she removed him from court and ordered a full investigation. Without conclusive evidence, he was later exonerated, but his reputation was ruined and she was never seen publicly with him again. On October 10, 1562, Elizabeth felt unwell and ordered her servants to draw her a bath. Perhaps a good soak would turn things around. They thought it foolish. Hygiene practices of the day were still on par with that of a 9-year-old boy. They feared exposure to soap and water would weaken her and leave her vulnerable to disease. In a few days, their suspicion was confirmed when their queen came down with a fever, muscle aches, and extreme fatigue. Soon she lost the ability to speak. Her doctors and courtiers exchanged whispers and worried looks. It was smallpox, a plague running rampant throughout Europe. Smallpox is a communicable disease spread through face-to-face contact, contact with infected bodily fluids, or contaminated items like clothing and bedding. In small spaces like buses and trains, it can also be airborne, but doesn't usually survive in the atmosphere very long. And no, you cannot contract it from a bath. She probably had become infected long before. The incubation period is anywhere from 7 to 19 days. Her doctors and ladies did what they could and hoped for the best. Initially, none of the telltale spots appeared, ones resembling measles or chickenpox. But still seriously ill and displaying every other sign of the devastating disease, her physicians concluded the pox must have been erupting inside and death was inevitable. It wasn't a bad guess. Nearly a third of those who contracted the disease died from it, and the young queen was barely in her 20s. Upon learning this, the Privy Council convened. As the last of her line and dreadfully unmarried, who would succeed her? While Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness, pox now covering her from head to toe, the royal advisors floated around possible names. There was the Earl of Huntingdon, who was a descendant of the Yorks, but didn't have much going for him other than the fact that he was a man. There was Jane Grey's sister, the Lady Catherine Grey, although no one was entirely sure she was up for the job, not after her sister's head met the chopping block and all. Then there was Mary, who, as the closest blood relative, was the obvious candidate. But she was still cozy with France and Catholic. None of them wanted to mess with that kind of baggage. So they continued to debate as they waited for their queen to expire. But one of the cousins left off the short list, the Lord Hunsdon, Henry Carey, contacted a German physician and brought him to consult. Upon seeing her unconscious and near death, the doctor ordered Elizabeth to be wrapped in red flannel and brought closer to the fire. In 2 hours, she was revived and even speaking. Presuming she had merely rallied, the council rushed to her side and pressed her to name her successor, but Elizabeth refused. When they pushed the sickly woman further, she shocked them all by naming Dudley temporary protector of the realm with a salary of £20,000. There was no need to do anything else, she assured them. She would recover shortly. And she was right. The move was brilliant. Assigning Dudley as a placeholder effectively prevented a coup from occurring behind her back. No one on the council was a fan of the man's, and therefore wouldn't be inclined to try to keep him there. For Dudley's part, He still remembered the way the council treated him during the murder investigation. And while the event did force Elizabeth to distance herself, he recognized that handling it the way she did allowed her to spare his life and hold the crown. Both were essential to him, too. If she was ever overthrown, the next to occupy her seat would surely reverse that decision. And the handsome income kept him happy and loyal. After a few weeks, she felt well enough to resume her duties, although it would still be a month or so before the sores on her face and arms healed. When they did, they left behind unsightly scars that left her looking speckled, and she found herself with a new problem. She couldn't rule ugly. Looks were everything. Any woman today can attest to the pressure placed on us to look a certain way, and she needed all the pretty power she could get. She could practically feel the iron locks click behind her as the troll of the tower. So she stayed out of sight until the scabs fell off and covered her face with thick layers of white makeup, creating what we think of today as her iconic look. In the 1600s, the European upper class considered fair white skin attractive, and clown white skin even better. To achieve this, women clamored for jars of Venetian ceruse, a highly sought-after makeup known to bleach the skin and conceal scars. It was made from artesian vinegar, fresh spring water, and lead. A whole lot of lead. So much lead. Powdered white lead was the secret ingredient that gave women that sought-after corpse-like appearance. While today we're aware of its extreme toxicity, all women of the day knew was that it worked. And since it didn't interfere with a man's ability to get and maintain erections, medical research wouldn't investigate this for some time. While the council was relieved their queen had survived the ordeal, mainly as it meant they didn't have to deal with that bohunk Dudley anymore, they still hadn't gotten any farther with obtaining a successor. Not to worry, Elizabeth said. She'd get right on that. Told exactly what they wanted to hear, they failed to grasp her true intent. She wasn't going to marry at all. There were a few reasons for this. First, of course, was the fact that any man she married would immediately vault over her in terms of power and influence. She had endured far too much to hand it over so easily. And even if she did manage to find a spouse she could control, the only reason for a union was to produce an heir. And that was just another person capable of removing her from power. Then, of course, was the promise she made herself so long ago, when she watched her father acquire and toss women aside like horses. She would never be put in that kind of position. The best way to stay safe was to stay single. But that wasn't something to be broadcast. The potential of a union was still a powerful bargaining chip. So she entertained proposals from foreign powers and royalty alike, while refusing to move on a single one. Instead, she set to cultivating an heir of her choosing, and it advertised the opening. Soon, the list of those applying for the spot included a king, a duke, a countess, a noblewoman, 2 stewards, 3 suffixes, a handful of earls, and our girl, Mary. Desperate to win, Mary sent letters to her cousin appealing to their mutual circumstance and girl power. To Elizabeth, family ties didn't mean much. Mary's overly strong attempts to seal the deal pushed her off. Her lineage was worrying enough. Acknowledging it would leave her vulnerable to her own country's Catholic faction. And when had she ever been able to trust a tutor? But she agreed to consider it, and the pair exchanged regular correspondence, trading warm sentiments and discussing the possibility of a face-to-face meet. Mary pressed the hardest. Everyone knew a meeting would all but seal the deal. But Elizabeth moved slowly, determined to keep her options open. Being second in line was a valuable commodity, almost the same as a potential marriage. Much like her potential suitors, Elizabeth wondered just how far Mary would go to make it happen, and how she could levy that. First, she pressured her to ratify the 1560 Treaty of Edinburgh, a contract which would have prevented Mary from claiming the throne altogether. But Mary refused, on grounds that it was literally the opposite she was going for. In her next letter, she gently redirected by reminding her dear cousin of their commonalities. Quote, "In one isle, of one language, the nearest kinswoman that each other had." A flowery sentiment, to be sure, but one that had an artificial sweetness to it. Then Elizabeth said she would be more inclined to do it, so long as she married a candidate backed by her. Mary eagerly agreed and pressed her cousin to tell her who she had in mind. But to her frustration, Elizabeth wouldn't say. Because she didn't have one. Eventually, Elizabeth suggested Dudley, whom she had recently promoted to the Earl of Lancashire for just such an occasion. She probably reasoned that a match with him would cool her jets. But Mary was disgusted and offended by her obvious hand-me-downs. When Elizabeth wouldn't commit to any better offers, she set her sights upon finding an acceptable match of her own. History traditionally records two things with regards to Mary's second marriage in July of 1565 to her cousin the Earl of Darnley. One is that she married him recklessly for love. The second is that the event was the provoking factor that permanently set her on Elizabeth's poop list. The second is a gross oversimplification, and the first is straight-up spin. While Darnley wasn't bad to look at, what was really attractive to Mary was his pedigree. He was another Tudor descendant on Henry's sister's side. A potential union would double her claim to the English throne. But if she didn't want the British Army to pay her a preemptive visit, she needed to obtain Elizabeth's permission first. And that was never going to happen. So when her Scottish council demanded to know the reason for her shotgun wedding, she claimed it was simply because she was passionately in love. At least, with the arrangement. In response, Mary's council flipped their shit, well aware of the consequences of stepping on a Tudor's toes. Heck, they were probably still putting out the fires from Henry VIII's rough wooing. They wanted nothing to do with her girlish stunts. Moray promptly rebelled, and Elizabeth pulled back from her pen pal. Aside from his good looks and invitations to the same family reunions, Darnley didn't have that much going for him. He was drunk and lazy with an uncanny ability to convince himself he was destined for greatness, even though he had no talents or aptitudes. Narcissistic and spoiled, he soon became the poster boy for her growing number of detractors. Eager to limit his potential future damage, and the number of comparisons between the much-missed Moray and her idiot boy, Mary cock-blocked him in matters of state, giving him no power or authority. Or input. That she left to her companion and personal secretary, David Riccio. While she missed her half-brother's counsel deeply, Riccio was an acceptable substitute. His guidance provided her with the security she needed to properly run the country. If the two were allowed to operate like that longer, Mary probably would have grown into a truly great regent. But Darnley had other ideas, and a posse of idiots to back him up. On March 9, 1566, he and his merry band of morons burst into her supper chamber at Holyrood House and murdered Riccio as Mary looked on screaming. She was helpless, 6 months pregnant with her and Darnley's first child. As it would when one's bestie is murdered by one's lunatic husband, the event gave Mary pause for concern. If a kind man with no power at all could warrant that kind of butchery, what would Darnley do to her? As she awaited the birth of the future James VI, she considered the terrifying answer. She also weighed her options. Divorce was out of the question. Not only would it erode her right to rule England and embolden the current sitting queen, but it would throw her child's legitimacy into question. and she didn't put up with Darnley's crazy ass to go through all that. She also couldn't escape him. She had no family or friends she could stay with. The closest thing to a battered women's shelter was a hole dug in the back 40 in some marsh, and she refused to take James into hiding. So, like many women today, she endured what she had to while making arrangements for her escape. She sent Elizabeth more letters about how happy she was to be a new mother and how much she wished she could share the event with her. She also named her his protector to further the bond and buy her some time. Her letters had a quality not unlike Catherine Parr's that Elizabeth found pleasing, so she didn't refuse. Although she did find out about James's Catholic baptism later and pushed her diplomats to suggest he be raised Protestant. With her heir and her status as Elizabeth's successor complete, at least presumably complete, only then did she set about freeing herself from Darnley. In early 1567, Darnley came down with an illness and holed up at Kirklefield House in Edinburgh to recuperate. Absent from his bedside was Mary, who was presumably too occupied with the duties of state to care for him. Not that she would be expected to. The pair had been living separately for some time. In the late hours of February 9th, an explosion occurred which rocked through town and leveled the lodge. At first glance, it was presumed no one in the house survived, until Darnley's body was discovered the next morning. Not amongst the rubble, but in the garden, strangled. Right away, many theories were posited to explain what happened, including that Darnley himself had been responsible. That version asserts that the dipshit had been plotting to kill Mary, and being the idiot he was caught up in his own trap. But to believe that would be to assume a lot of things. Namely, that he was knuckle-dragging stupid, and it failed to address how he was found yards away with a crushed windpipe. So it was quickly dismissed. Another scenario was that the culprits were nobles who hated Darnley, those who were motivated more by the prospect of wiping him off the map than the fact that there was practically no advantage in doing so. But that too was set aside. It seemed like a lot of work to settle a beef. But the idea that those responsible hated him seemed like a good place to start, and authorities knew just where to look for someone like that. The Earl of Bothwell, James Hepburn. According to contemporaries, Bothwell was a vainglorious, rash, and hazardous young man. He was also a known associate of Mary's. There were even rumors that the two had been having an affair. As the investigation proceeded, which, let's face it, didn't consist of much more than stomping out ashes and sifting through the remains, it was said that she had been seen with Bothwell quite a bit within the last 8 months. More than enough to be noticeable, and that the two had plotted Darnley's death to make a marriage between them possible. There were even rumors she was pregnant by Bothwell. But like I said, these were only rumors. Any charges of Mary being promiscuous were driven by her adversaries and Darnley's friends, all assholes with an axe to grind. Historians assert there is no evidence that the two had a love affair of any kind. Except the casket letters, a collection of poems and love letters supposedly written by Mary to Bothwell. But most researchers consider them suspect and probably fraud. But where the evidence was never enough to convict the two, the optics definitely were. After he was acquitted of all charges by a court largely controlled by Mary, Bothwell was released and the couple married just 3 months later. While the move left her court and council reeling, the pairing wasn't outside Mary's wheelhouse. She was tired, insecure, and uncomfortable. She was a queen, yes, but she wasn't really into getting her hands dirty. And lest we forget, she'd always existed under the protection of a man. Why change that now? But things looked considerably different to her nobles and commoners, who saw the move as more suspicious. Protestants saw it as a clear display of corruption, while her fellow Catholics branded them adulterers. And if Elizabeth had a differing opinion, it certainly was not supportive. But she kept it to herself, waiting to see how her cousin was going to dig herself out of this one. Almost at once, Bothwell showed his true colors, proving to be a bigger douchebag than Darnley. Not content to be the Queen's boy toy, he sought power for himself, and had no problem resorting to violence to do it. Those nobles willing to forgive Mary for this risky alliance thought better of it. Bothwell wasn't acting like a prince consort. He was acting like a king. So the Protestant lords gathered forces and rose against her and her army at Carberry Hill on June 15, 1567. The couple was quickly defeated. They parted during the battle that very same day. Bothwell fled to Scandinavia, where he was quickly arrested and imprisoned, dying in Denmark in 1578. Mary fled to Dunbar, never seeing him again. In the summer of 1567, she was captured and imprisoned in Leven Castle, where she gave birth to stillborn twins and was formally deposed in favor of her 1-year-old son. Reeling from the defeat, both politically and from her pregnancy, she couldn't help but reevaluate things. Where did it all go so wrong? It's unlikely that she took any of the responsibility herself. It wasn't her fault that she was pretty and charming and better than anyone else. And royalty was her birthright, her destiny. Just like some people were born to be cooks and some people cobblers. It's just the way things were. I mean, what else would happen to all those poor domestics if there was no one to serve? Did anyone ever think of that? She saw a brief brush with freedom in 1568 when a small band of supporters attempted a coup and sprung her from jail. Their forces were defeated on May 13th at the Battle of Langside near Glasgow by the controlling faction. Defeated once and for all, Mary fled south to seek shelter in England, where undoubtedly a warm welcome was waiting from her dear sister queen. Historians claim Mary sought refuge in England out of desperation, hoping the deep bond the cousins shared would prompt her protection. But that Elizabeth sorely lacked. And with all the political cunning of a snake, employed a series of flimsy excuses to hold poor Mary prisoner instead. But that depiction is about as sugar-coated as you can get, without having to display a nutritional label touting the risks of acquiring diabetes. There was no deep emotional connection, only a convenient one. Entitled to her core, Mary ran to England as a reflex. Even in a state of panic, she was sure she would be protected simply because of her status. And while the mindset of everything going your way simply as a birthright was completely alien to her, there was no way Elizabeth missed it. She saw it coming a mile away. So once she reached the shore, she gave Mary a reality check the best way she knew how. She placed Mary under arrest. Now, that's not saying that this was a particularly safe decision. It was actually politically awkward. Entitled and clueless as she was, Mary was still an anointed monarch of a separate sovereign country. And one doesn't mess around with things like that, unless one wants to bring those same kinds of actions upon themselves. She might not have known about the latest French dances, but Elizabeth knew karma. But Mary's road trip afforded her an opportunity to stop this nonsense once and for all. So, using her Scottish antics as an excuse, Elizabeth placed her cousin under house arrest until further notice. Or until the drama died down, whichever came first. Yeah, she knew there was no chance of that either. But she was doing the best she could. Mary was a lot, you know. For the next 18 years, Mary was bounced around from castle to castle. just as she did when she was a child so many years ago. In letters, she described her captivity as long and wearisome, only partly allied with the consolations of her cold and hostile captor. But in reality, it was pretty nice. Elizabeth commanded she be kept in relative comfort, giving her a small retinue of servants to keep her company. Mary was also permitted to regularly exercise her religion, indulge in hobbies like embroidery, and even keep pets like lapdogs and singing birds. It was certainly a better deal than she got, both when she was bastardized by her father as a toddler and when she was locked in the tower by her sister. But Mary was clueless of the gesture. She turned her nose up at her accommodations and complained that the unjustified confinement was dull and boring. She blasted Elizabeth with constant letters begging for her freedom, reminding her of their familiar bond, posing the two could be partners instead of enemies. In response, Elizabeth ghosted her. Experts cite this lack of reply to claim her true feelings for Mary are unknown. But I think this is a polite way to separate Elizabeth from the rest of us and deny everything she went through. And that's just not fair. Not only to Elizabeth, but to anyone else who has ever grown up in a dysfunctional family. To Elizabeth, the T in Tudor stood for trauma. Even the relatives she knew intimately treated her like a threat or disposable. Was Mary any different? Nothing about her behavior would support that. She followed the Tudor playbook word for word. So the fact that Elizabeth was cautious and didn't rush to burn or behead her does speak to the true feelings she had for her, and really speaks to a level of humanity that set her apart. She even permitted her cousin to correspond with her supporters, something she herself had never been permitted the 2 times she was imprisoned. But all Mary saw was a diminished lifestyle and less than 5-star accommodations, which she complained about in her letters to them constantly. In addition to her growing lack of relevancy, Mary began noticing a physical and mental decline. The lack of opportunities for exercise and the dietary limitations of house arrest caused her to gain weight, something she found intolerable. Her mood turned dark and desperate. If she could not be known for her title or her beauty, who was she? Soon, her wardrobe reflected such, as she replaced her trendy French gowns for black velvet and white veils. In time, these messages, too, began to change. Pleas to lobby on her behalf changed to hints that she was open to a rescue. And when that didn't produce her desired results, conspiracy. Of those waiting in the wings for Elizabeth to screw up were her Catholic countrymen, who believed that by wiping out Boleyn's bastard, they could restore England to its pre-Anglican glory. And maybe squeak out a little more influence for themselves. Under one Mary, they'd seen progress. Perhaps they would see a little bit more under another. So in 1586, the conspirators formed what would be later called the Babington Plot, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Like every other opportunity afforded her, it wasn't as much an endorsement of her capabilities as an acknowledgement of her pedigree. As the highest-ranked monarch in the Catholic food chain, she was the natural choice. But when they approached Mary about it, in coded messages smuggled amongst her supplies, they didn't word it that way. They played to her privilege, and she fell for it. When her jailers learned of the plan, they immediately sent word to the firm. It was the last straw. Elizabeth's ministers demanded Mary's head. Recalling a list of religious plots that had grown far too long for anyone to recall off the top of their head, Mary's actions went too far, they cried. She would always be a threat, so long as she lived. Those words had a calculated sting. On October 25, 1586, Mary was tried by an English court and convicted of treason. James, who had not seen his mother in decades, and had since been raised with his sights fixed firmly on the English throne, raised no objections to either the conviction or the sentence. Death. But unlike other sentences carried out in the Tudor name, Mary's didn't come quickly. There was no legal or administrative excuse to postpone it. It just didn't. Because Elizabeth didn't want it to. Our girl was nothing if not efficient and decisive. Had she been truly outraged by the stunt, Mary probably wouldn't have lasted a week. Instead, she just moved it to her to-do list. It took her almost 3 months to sign the death warrant, and even then, the document was concealed inside a stack of other papers requiring her signature. So, there is some question as to whether or not Elizabeth intended to sign it, even when she did. Either way, she wasn't in a big hurry to put her cousin on the chopping block. Maybe, like a lot of us with predatory relations, she just didn't want to be that kind of a person. Her actions don't appear to be that of a cold, calculating ruler hell-bent on retaining power. They look like someone just trying to protect themselves, as best she could. And lest we forget, killing a queen of a sovereign nation was a really dangerous precedent. If Mary could be executed, couldn't she? But after years of excusing and ignoring, she just ran out of ways to keep it going. Her ministers were foaming at the mouth. No doubt her supporters in court were as well. And to show leniency yet again might give the impression that she was sentimental or soft, neither of which would make things any easier. Mary was taken to Fotheringhay Castle in North Hampshire to await her sentence. Gone was any hopes of rescue or even that grand destiny she'd been fed so much as a child. Now, with any luck, James would inherit the throne. But did that mean anything? Surely he would be educated to Elizabeth's liking and taught to hate her for killing his father and countless other offenses. At this point, with her regalness stripped away, without jewels or palaces, without the comforts of court, save her ladies and the guards who had been kind to her, Mary began looking inward for significance. Towards the end of her time in captivity, she embroidered the following as an epitaph: "In my end is my beginning." History would go on to record she met her end with the great personal dignity of any sovereign ruler. On February 8, 1587, around 8 a.m., she was escorted to the scaffold by those guards and servants that had remained at her side all those years. The ones who had seen her rant, plot, and come to accept her fate. As he helped her up the stairs, she thanked the headsman for making an end to all my troubles, before kneeling before the execution block. As she waited for the swing, she quietly uttered a string of final prayers and stretched out her arms to assist the fall of the axe. Whether it helped or not is up for debate. It still took 3 strikes to do the job. After which, the executioner snatched the severed head and, holding it up triumphantly with his best T-Man impression, shouted, "God save the Queen!" But, as with many over-the-top victory laps, this proved better in theory than in practice. The idiot failed to recognize Mary's costuming, so when he raised the head for the crowd to see, it fell, and he was left holding a wig. History is remiss in recording the sickening thud of her head landing on the platform or the fresh spray of its contents from the impact. But suffice to say, I don't think Elizabeth would have been very impressed. Leave it to a man. Mary was buried, head and all, at nearby Peterborough Cathedral. She was 44. Historians would later dissect her political maneuverings with all the gusto of an armchair quarterback 48 hours after ESPN's panel coverage, calling her anything from a pitiful, unfortunate ruler to a study in failure. To this day, she's frequently faulted for other traits completely out of her control, namely that she was Catholic and a woman. But while it is certainly true that being a man and religiously akin to Elizabeth might have made things easier, I don't think it would have been a sure thing either. Plenty of shirt-tail relatives fit this criteria, and they didn't necessarily prove to be any better for it. I think the fact that she knew who she was proved to be her greatest strength. True, had she been any other run-of-the-mill man in court, she may have avoided capture. But would Mary have made history? I doubt it. With shedding skin and her hair falling out by the clump, Elizabeth suffered severe depression in the years that followed. Probably not as severe as the lead poisoning, but we'll give her that. Her declining appearance, more closely resembling Francis Ford Coppola's elderly Dracula than Mina or Lucy, led her to avoid mirrors at all cost. In her later days, her staff had a standing order to remove them prior to her entry. As her health concerns continued to mount, she began showing other signs as well. Whispers in court began to circulate of the Queen's declining cognitive function and delirium. And she seemed to be moving slower, with more physical distress. Acutely aware that any appearance of such would leave her vulnerable, Elizabeth pushed on. As if willing herself to continue, she stubbornly refused anything resembling comfort. She would stand for hours during council business, refusing rest or even a chair. Anything besides business as usual was picking a fight. She refused to allow doctors to examine her, a tidbit some historians point to as a sign that she secretly feared the worst. But even if she did, I don't know that that would have been very helpful. They were decades away from understanding the effects of lead poisoning. And, lest we forget, these doctors worked for a family not known for taking bad news well. So wouldn't it be more likely that they would have just told her whatever she wanted to hear? Perhaps she already knew that and didn't want to waste her time. But the fact that she didn't lose her shit decades before is a testament to how strong she was, which is pretty impressive. Sure, she'll never be known as a happy, cuddly historical figure, and she was far from well-adjusted. But against every obstacle placed in front of her, Elizabeth held her own. And that's saying something. Elizabeth died in 1603, surrounded by mindless lackeys. If so much of her childhood and later life could be considered tragic, her death went much the same way. She was alone, reminded until the very end that almost all relationships were, to any ruler, just political. After her death, Mary's son James became James I of England, finally uniting the kingdoms. In 1612, he had his mother's body exhumed and reinterred at Westminster Abbey. Placed in a vault nearer to the other significant royals she tried so hard to be among in life. Although he had few memories of her, he commissioned a monument be added that was more fitting of a true anointed queen. At the same time, he rehoused Queen Elizabeth to a less prominent tomb. But given that the best times of her life, those in which she felt most comfortable and safe, were also removed from royalty, I don't think she would have minded. This has been Frenemies. Thanks for listening. Frenemies is a production of Toil and Trouble Media. Executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Aaron Iris, and our music was performed by Snowflake and Admiral Bob. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen and tell your friends. It's a cheap way to support us, and it really helps the show get noticed. Tell your frenemies, too. We're good with that. And be sure to subscribe wherever you listen and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. If you want even more Toil and Trouble media in your life, be sure to check out our Patreon page, where, for a couple bucks, you can get access to early and ad-free episodes of all our shows, and our website at toilandtroublemedia.com, where we have merch, blogs, and much more. And as always, thanks for listening.